So that's this recording now, so I'll make a start. So this morning I'm going to be talking about making data open and hopefully everything that you need to know to be able to do that. So I'm going to start off a little bit talking a little bit about what open data is. I'm going to move on to the process of making your data fair. From there on to talking a little bit about the different kinds of repositories that are available to use and which might be best suited for your needs. And I'll finish with talking a little bit about open licensing for data and for coding. So it's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour this morning, and there'll be an opportunity at the end for you to ask questions. So to begin, what exactly is open data and what are we talking about? So open data is freely available on the internet. Any user is permitted to download, copy, analyze, reprocess, and reuse it for any other purpose with minimum financial, legal, and technical barriers. And it's also really important to mention what it's not. So it's not data that's stored in private files, available only by request, and I'm sure everyone's come across that at some point. And when you're looking to look at somebody's data and it's available only by request, it can be really frustrating. And in that case, it's often lost to the public, and in some cases lost to the researchers that created it. Currently, there's still only a small proportion of data being made openly available, but that is growing. And this is starting to change, partly driven by funder requirements. And so we'll go on to talk a little bit about some of those reasons. So why should you make your data open? To begin with, it's good science. You're adding to the knowledge pool, which can only be a good thing. And you might have your data used in someone else's research, and maybe the case that you, for funding reasons or for other reasons, you can't take research any further, but you've done, you've created a pool of research data, and it may be that somebody else can pick that up and do something else with it if your data's out there. And as I mentioned earlier, you'll be meeting funder and institutional requirements. So funders are starting to be a little bit more explicit about requirements. Last year, NIH released a statement to say that from January this year, so from last month, applicants would be required to submit a data management plan and comply with it. EPSRC have always been quite explicit. They're asking for data management. They have their data management cost built into the grant application. They ask that you deposit in a repository, obtain a DOI, and include a statement with your publication. Horizon 2020 also asked for data to be submitted in a repository, and they published quite a bit of guidance on data management and making data fair. Last year also, there was the big sort of statement from the White House in America, which they're calling the Nelson Memo, from the Office of Science and Technology. And they're asking, it's going to be sort of slightly phased in, but they're asking that data, not just data from research findings, but all publicly funded data will be made available. And others are likely to follow that example. So funder requirements are starting to go down that road. Also means that your work can be confirmed by somebody else, and as I said, extended, avoids things like p-hacking and harking. And this statement's really important as well. More of a carrot than a stick, I suppose. But in our PLAUSE study in 2020 found a correlation of up to 25% more citations for articles that share their data in a repository, which can only be a good thing. And as an early career researcher, it's a great way to get more exposure and make more contacts. So I'm going to talk just quickly about reproducibility versus replicability. And what we're aiming for with data sharing is that idea of reproducibility. So it's the idea that the same analysis can be performed with the same data and code, but obviously by a different person. And so you kind of starting to think about the effort and energy you're going to have to put into presenting that data for somebody else to come along and be able to reproduce that research exactly as you've done it. And that's as opposed to replicability, where you're reperforming the experiment using your own data to create your own set of results. And there's a little kind of graph there showing that it's generally agreed that there is a reproducibility crisis. More than half of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce someone else's scientific experiments. And more worrying, more than half have failed to reproduce their own experiments. So it shows that quite a bit of work is needed. So we're aiming for transparency in methods, not just data sharing, and that allows trust in a piece of research, especially as it moves from development into production. You might have some worries about sharing data, and these are the kind of commonly mentioned ones. You might be worried that your data might be misinterpreted. However, if you provide good data documentation when publishing, it's less likely to be misinterpreted. People often worry, is my data interesting enough to be put out there? Lots of data sets were collected before climate change became a big topic. Even amateur garden diaries were collected in those days, and people at the time might have thought, why is this data being collected and put out there? It's not interesting at all. And some of those have become, a really sort of big deal now that climate change research is a big topic. So you don't know when your data might be required in the future, and if it's there, then it's available to be reused. People might contact me and ask questions. Research at the end of the day is all about learning from other people and collaborating, and it can only be a good thing if people contact you and ask questions about your data. Help, my data's in a mess. I think it's generally agreed that people get better at organising their data as their career progresses, and that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be shared. And again, you might feel that you're too busy. And as I said, the funder mandates are starting to push for it to become more of a priority. So time's got to be made for it and money put aside to make sure that it's something that can be done. And something that's often a worry is this idea of scooping. I think it's generally agreed that it's very unlikely to happen. If you use a good repository, you give your data set a DOI, then you'll be credited for any work that belongs to you. So what are you being asked to deposit? Not just data, but we need data about your data too, if that doesn't sound too ridiculous. Your data needs a narrative of its own to help others to understand and potentially reuse it. And that brings us on to this idea of metadata, which I'm going to come on to speak a little bit about. So how do you go about sharing this data? The first thing that you need to do is make a data management plan. I'm not going to say too much about that. Digital Research do some really good courses. There are really good resources out there like Argos and DMP online. And I'll share some links with you that can point you in the right direction for using these. Keep track of everything, keep track of where it comes from. Something that you might consider doing is pre-registering, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Share and obviously license your data, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end as well. And report transparently, including all data and code in your articles. And again, most researchers say that their data sharing practices evolve and get more organised and rigorous as their career develops. So it's an ongoing process. So I've just shared with you some links here to Digital Research, and they can give lots of help putting together data management plans. And there's some publicly available DMPs online, which are useful to go and have a look at some on Zenodo. So pre-registration, this might be something that you might consider doing. Why would you consider this? So if you're pre-registering, you're specifying your research and analysis plan in advance, and this can be a really good and extra way to enforce this planning stage. Any decisions that you make at this stage will be recorded, which means that there can be no accusations that you've fudged your data or looked for things that aren't there. It's also a chance to plan data collection methods, submit your data plan and how you're going to deal with it. So there's various resources online that you can use for this. OSF, along with doing many other things, offer a pre-registration option, which is more of a kind of generalised one. And then there are subject discipline-specific ones online, like preclinical trials and as predicted. And there are lots more out there as well. So that might be something to consider. So in an ideal world, you've got your data management plan, you might have pre-registered, you start to collect and organise your data. When you're ready to publish, you might consider publishing in a preprint, you'll publish open access, and then at the end of all that, you share your data, your methods, your code, and hopefully giving them an open license. And managing your data this way gives the project continuity if there are staff changes. Being organised at the end of the day saves time and ultimately allows you to comply with your funder requirements. So how do you begin to prepare your data to be shared openly? I'm going to go on to talk about making data fair, but before I do that, I'm just going to quickly share this slide. All data obviously can follow the FAIR principles, but not all data can be completely made open. And it's just quickly to sort of make sure everybody understands that is the case. There's always going to be sensitive data, health data, data of people's personal details that can't be shared. And in those cases, it might be possible to share methodology rather than the data itself. But this is often mentioned when talking about fair and open data, making your data as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. So the FAIR principles are there to make data digestible for human and machines. And as I said, it's not only intended for open data, but applies to all data, whether it can be made open or not. The principles apply to metadata as well as to the data itself. And the really important thing here is that they're principles and not standards. They're not something that have to be ticked off. They're something that can be used as a guide and applied gradually to your work and gradually through your career, and used as a sort of something to aim for, really. I just put this slide in here to show you that these principles can be a little bit overwhelming. There are 15 of them. And again, you're not expected to tick off all of these or to understand them all. It can be quite a sort of overwhelming idea to be faced with. This is a kind of slightly easier way of breaking it down. So when we're talking about the FAIR principles, we're findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and that's the aim for your data. So when we're talking about findable, it's things like using permanent identifiers, storing your data in a good repository. To make it accessible, using open file formats. Interoperable is always the trickier one to explain and trickier one for people to understand, but using things like ontologies and vocabularies, and again, open file formats so that your data is accessible across different resources, and reusable licensing, which we'll touch on at the end. But as you can see across each of these 4 ideas is this idea of metadata, which is the kind of really sort of founding idea. So we'll go on to talk a little bit about that. So your data needs metadata to describe it, and that's the really important idea. And here I've kind of set out the minimum metadata that you would want to be applying to your data. So we've got the title, and we've got the project description, and when you're giving your data sets titles and describing them, it's really a good idea to think about things outside of your discipline. It might make a lot of sense to you, but will it make sense to somebody else? Is it interdisciplinary? Can it be understood outside of your own discipline? And will it be understood in the future? We've got creators, identifiers like giving your data a DOI. Most of the repositories will will help you to assign a DOI. If they don't, we can do that for you through our repository Pure. Then you've got your funder, your rights, and your access information. Do you want to apply any embargoes to your data? Hopefully not, but if you need to, you can at this stage. You've got your project description and your subject keywords as well. Important to think about using subject keywords that are meaningful as well outside of your own discipline. So things like methodology, it's your experimental protocol, things that you would include in a lab notebook, your data structure, relationships between files, any coding structures that you've used, and variable names, explanation of any codes or variables, and the file naming structure. And a lot of that can go into a README file, which will stay with your data if your files are moved around or put into a repository, and have all the explanation in there. So it's important to keep notes about where you got your data as you go along, so that you and others can find it. So this is your kind of minimum metadata, and some repositories will allow you to expand on that as well. These are some really good resources that I've found for looking at FAIR data, and it's worth going off and having a look at them. So fairsharing.org, you can search by journal, by repository, or by a particular funder to get detailed policies. There were 32 funder data policies from the main funders when I last looked into it, and it's quite good up-to-date information. ARDC is a self-checklist, so it just asks you a series of questions about your data. You don't have to score 100% again. You know, everything's a kind of small gain each time that you look at it, and it'll give you sort of ideas about how you might make your data just ever so slightly more fair each time. So those are really worth looking at. From there, we're going to go on to talk a little about the different kinds of repositories that are available. So these are the kind of 4 main types of repository. At one end of the scale, I guess it's not even really a repository, but a journal service for supplementary material, through to your kind of really disciplinary specific repositories. And I'm just going to go on to talk a little bit about each of these, what they can offer, and how they might be suited to different needs. So journal requirements, often this is linked to your article, made available by the publisher, and it can fulfill the requirements of the publisher, but it can be frustrating if you're on the other end of this, and if you're reading an article and you think, you know, this is really good, I'd like to have a look at this data. You often find that you have to contact the author to access this additional information. And it's often limited to tables and appendices and what can be sort of linked into the article rather than complete data sets. So it will sometimes comply with funder requirements, but I would say it's at the kind of minimal end of the spectrum. Next, we've got PURE, which is our institutional repository. So this links out to your profile. We would really encourage you to please give us fill out information on any data sets that you've stored elsewhere, give us the links to them, add them to PURE or ask us to add them to PURE, and this will be linked out to your profile, which is really important. You've got your research outputs on there, and it's really important to have your data sets and data information on there as well. There's links with other university systems from PURE, so this can give an overview of your whole sort of profile, which is really useful. They're really good Panopto guides available on the web pages, but if you're ever stuck with adding anything to it, please contact us. Obviously, as you might already know, PURE is used for ref submissions, but it's not only used for ref submissions. We really encourage you to share your data and research outputs on there, and this is really just good practice, so we'd encourage you to do that. It can also be used as a repository as well, but there are size limits on storage. But if you feel that that's something that would be useful for you, then please get in touch with us and we can help you with that. Then there are a whole range of generic repositories now, and the kind of more well-known ones like Zenodo, OSF, Figshare, will obviously are out there online and will attract a wider audience. They're interdisciplinary, but they kind of probably allow slightly more simple metadata than your kind of disciplinary specific ones. age.org provides a grid. I've just put a little link in here, providing a comparison of the main generic repositories by size limit, license options, and that can be quite useful if you're thinking about what your needs are. Most will allow for linking data to other digital information now, like DataCite and ORCID, and as I said, will allow you to gain persistent identifiers for your data. Dryad now have as a nodal integration for non-data files like code and software, and this seems to be something that a few of them are doing now. Figshare have a GitHub integration, so you can import your Gits into the repository into Figshare, and it will allow you to assign DOIs to them, which you can't do directly on GitHub. Most are free to use for reasonable dataset sizes. I think Dryad has a small setup fee, and they're constantly evolving and adding new services. OSF can be a really useful place to organize a project. You can add contributors, share documents, store files, create tags, see changes in versions, add people into your project, create a little summary of your project, which really confusingly they call a wiki. But Zenode's is a really great place, and it's becoming quite common now for people to put things like lectures and training sessions up there on their OSF page as well, which is really handy. If you see something that you like that somebody's done, it can be a really good way of finding more. And then at the other end of the scale, we've got the discipline-specific repositories. So as you can see from the graph, deposits to Pride have risen really, quite sort of heftily in the last 10 years. And so these are becoming quite popular. They're likely to offer you a slightly more tailored service, discipline specific with more discipline knowledge, and obviously will be more widely used by people, but only within your discipline. More data curation is offered, and more specific standards are required. They may be a bit more selective in the data that they accept as well. And again, there are many of these, and you'll probably find many within your own discipline. So this is a slightly new species in scholarly publication, which has sprung up in the last few years, data paper journals. And this has grown out of the open data movement. The movement began really in science, and so this is, again, sort of beginning in the sciences. This allows shorter articles than, compared with the research output, but the shorter article will then be used to describe the data and methods that you're putting into the journal and linking to. And that can be a really good way of sort of curating a data set and getting it out there in a more detailed way. And I've only mentioned 4 here, there are more, but again, a kind of growing area that's kind of sprung up in response to the growing kind of open data movement. Always look for this seal when you're using repositories to make sure that they're trustworthy, sustainable, show that they're transparent in their processes and compliant with standards. So this is the Core Trust seal. They have to complete a self-assessment and reviewed by community peers for their strengths and weaknesses. And this will ensure long-term data preservation. So finally, it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Finally, I'm going to come on to licensing data and code, because this is the final step in making your data open. So your data isn't really open until you license it and remove any doubt for the other person about what they can do with it. Applying a license removes that uncertainty, grants reuse for somebody. You hold on to the ability to modify conditions and infringements that you might want to place, but it ultimately makes it really clear what people are able to do with it. And the clearer you are, the more likely people are to respect your wishes. So it's a really important thing to do. So firstly, you need to check if your data can be licensed. Check who owns the data. If you don't, then you need to go about finding out. And then lastly, think about what kind of license that you want to apply to the data. So everyone will be familiar with the Creative Commons licenses, often used for things like research outputs, and they're universally recognisable, they're easy to apply, and they go from really quite open CC BY through to quite a lot of restrictions, NC and ND, and share alike and that sort of thing. But how do these work when dealing with data? That's the question. So when talking about things like attribution, if you want to acknowledge dataset C at the end here, but you have to acknowledge all the contributors to each work that it's derived from, and if it's the end of a very long chain, or if large teams of contributors have been involved, the list of credits might become overwhelming, and that would lead to something called attribution stacking with data, and so it becomes quite a difficult thing with data as opposed to sort of research generally. Again, with share alike, share alike states that you must distribute remixes under the same license as the original, but that might be incompatible with other material that the user might want to use in their remix of the data. So again, that's a bit of a tricky one. Similarly with no derivatives, if you remix or build upon the material, you can't distribute the modified material. But with a data set, it's often impossible to extract just the parts that you might want to use. So these become a little bit tricky when talking about data. And so for that reason, it often makes sense to use an open license with your data, especially if you want someone else to reuse it, or if you want someone else to have the option to reuse it. That would allow that interoperability that we were talking about, that's so important when making data open. So that's the CC0 license. Yep, and I've put oh, sorry, just gone to, so I was going to go from there to talking about licensing code. So different kinds of licenses that are available for licensing code. At one end of the spectrum, we've got the proprietary licenses, type of licenses used by software companies, where the source code is kept closely guarded. And at the other end, we've got the permissive licenses, where all rights are given, typically the MIT and Apache licenses, and these are often called FOSS, free and open source licenses. And these give even the right for somebody to relicense. In between that, we've got the copyleft licenses. Others can copy and distribute as long as they track changes in the source code, and these are typically the GPL licenses. They don't allow proprietization for anyone to distribute closed source versions. And as I said, you must pass along the changes in the source code that you've made. So these are the kind of three different types. This is a really useful little table that I've found. It shows how some of the software licenses compare and match up to some of the CC licenses, so give you like the equivalent to the CC licenses that you'd be using for data. So you've got your permissive licenses, MIT and Apache, GPL, copyleft, all the way up to proprietary, and when typically almost no sort of rights are given. So that's a really useful thing to have a look at. There's also some resources that I've found that are really useful here as well. Public License Selector asks you a series of questions about the best and comes up with the best license for your situation. Choose a license, again, ask what kind of license you want, and gives a really good summary of all the licenses available. So it's a really good one to learn from as well. So thank you. As I said, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We've left a little bit of time for questions. If you've got any questions, then please go ahead and ask. If there's anything that you think that you want us to sort of go into in slightly more detail in the future, it would be really useful to get that in your feedback as well. And then we can sort of adjust things sort of directly to what people's needs are. But yeah, over to you for any questions. And also put anything in the chat that you want. I actually just realised that it's Pancake Day today, and it's a shame we're not having this in person. We could have had pancakes.